Late in the afternoon on May 6, 2014, 77-year-old Helene Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with her beloved dog Belle at her feet and a phone pressed to her ear. On the other end was one of Helene's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was complain. This time, there was a problem with their water heater, and the plumber was late. Helene listened patiently, because she was a landlord and that was her job. But when her tenant was finished, Helene told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and they were not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Now, Helene knew her tenant would not like that comment, but she also didn't have patience for entitled wealthy snobs. But unfortunately for her, she actually spent a lot of time with people like that because Helene was actually the single richest woman in Monaco and therefore attracted a lot of these people. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on three sides by France. So the two countries share a lot of cultural similarities. But Monaco is very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in luxury condos and high-rises that cover the entire tiny coastline. And Helene and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they had thousands of high-income tenants and were among the wealthiest landlords on the planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had begun 3 generations earlier, and Helene was now in charge of it. Now, it was obviously a ton of work, and Helene theoretically could pass it off to somebody else to do. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had. Which was why Helene was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests. Now, Helene leaned back in her chair to scratch her dog Belle's head, and she watched as Belle closed her eyes, and suddenly Helene felt the urge to do the same thing. However, she still needed to call her daughter, Sylvia, before she left for the day. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier, so Helene naturally worried about her a lot and made sure to check in on her daily. Helene reached for the phone again and dialed Sylvia's number. When she heard her daughter say hello on the other end, Helene asked her how she was feeling. But Sylvia said she couldn't talk because her massage therapist had just arrived. So she excused herself and hung up. Helene stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, trying hard not to feel hurt. It was moments like these where Helene wondered if her own daughter even liked her. But deep down, Helene knew exactly who to actually blame here. Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everybody in Monaco absolutely loved him. He was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity, but Helene had always felt like there was something off about him, and she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's famous last name. But she couldn't bring herself to actually tell Sylvia about her suspicions, so instead, they had a lot of unspoken tension, which caused lots of little arguments. Helene looked over at the time, then stood and smoothed out her Chanel suit. She needed to get on with it if she wanted to see her son, Gildo, tonight. Gildo had been at the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke, and so Helene visited him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was a lot, especially because Helene was always so busy, but she never even considered doing anything else. Gildo was 47 years old, but he was still her child, and the whole ordeal had been awful and emotional for Helene, especially on top of Sylvia's cancer diagnosis. Seeing her children suffer like this had reminded Helene that money really couldn't save you from everything, even in Monaco. Helene grabbed her very expensive Hermes purse, then told her dog Belle it was time to go. Helene and Belle walked out the door of her office and climbed into a black minivan that was waiting on the curb. As soon as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwich. Mohammed had been working with Helene for the past 15 years, and while he primarily was her driver, he also did cooking and other things, and basically whatever Helene needed, which sometimes was just to be a friend. And that's really what she needed today. So the two spent the 45-minute drive to Nice talking about their kids. Helene filled him in on Sylvia's cold shoulder that day, and how she was also feeling relieved that Gildo might be released from the hospital soon. Then Mohammed told her about how he was missing his own daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom. And he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go a lot faster, and before Helene knew it, They were at the hospital. By about 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting by Gildo's bedside, helping him drink some water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the pastor work ethic. Despite all the family money, Gildo was constantly starting new ventures and investing in businesses. His latest thing was a new electric racing car, and he really wanted to focus on it, but obviously he couldn't because he was in the hospital. And Helene knew that. She knew that this hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but, sort of emotionally. He wanted to get back to work. Gildo was awake and alert, but he was still partially paralyzed, and he couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with her son, talking to him and checking in with his doctors, and after about an hour, she kissed his forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene left the hospital and walked over to the minivan where Mohammed was. She climbed into the front passenger seat this time because Belle had stretched out in the back seat. Mohammed started the car and began making his way out of the lot towards the busy streets of Nice. The exit was very congested, with cars trying to get around one another and pedestrians kept crossing the street. But eventually, Mohammed was finally able to pull out of the lot and turn right before pretty much immediately getting stopped again by traffic. Helene simply leaned back in her seat and just let the noise outside fade to a blur as she tried to just accept that she'd be in traffic for a while, and so she should just relax. But as soon as she put her head back, suddenly something out her window caught her eye. It was a person jogging straight towards them. This person had a hat pulled down low around their eyes, so Helene didn't know who it was, but then she saw what they were holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive, but before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. Then Helene was dimly aware of the pedestrians all around the car screaming before she heard another bang, and then everything went black. About 15 minutes later, the commissioner of the Nice police, Philippe Frisson, pulled up to the hospital with the sirens on. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he had heard a call about potential shots fired, but he had no idea how serious it was. So when he got to the scene, he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was this big crowd of people gathered on the street right across from the hospital. And they all appeared to be staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and a shattered passenger side window. Frisson jogged over. He was the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the crowd had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, hitting both the man and the woman who were inside, both in the head. There had been a dog in the car, but it was uninjured. The shooter had disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man, also dressed in black, follow after him. The firefighter said the 2 victims had been rushed to the hospital and were clearly in critical condition, but beyond knowing it was a man and a woman, he had no other information on their identities. Immediately, Frisson's mind went to carjacking. Nice didn't have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars stuck in traffic for robbery. He wondered if maybe the carjackers, in an effort to rob this car, had somehow gotten flustered or something had happened which caused them to open fire, and then they quickly realized the area was far too crowded to just get away, so they abandoned their robbery and just disappeared. Frisson radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this clearly needed more officers than just him. And when Frisson got through to the dispatcher, not only did she say she would dispatch more officers, but also she had some new information. The identities of the 2 victims. And the reason she already had their identities is because one of the 2 victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was the Helene Pastor, and the other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwich. Frisson instantly froze, because of course he knew Helene Pastor's name. Everyone did. She was the matriarch of the Pastor dynasty, who owned most of Monaco. She not only had billions of dollars, but she had connections to Monaco's actual royal family. And so even though Frisson had been on the force for over 30 years by this point, when he heard this new piece of critical information, suddenly he felt nervous. This was going to be, by far, the most high-profile case he had ever worked. And also now that he knew the identities of his victims, his theory of what actually happened here completely changed. There was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. This had to be a hit. Frisson got off his radio and walked over to the minivan and looked inside. He could see there was a purse on the dashboard covered in glass shards, and this solidified his belief that this was no robbery. But then he noticed something else. The front seats were covered in all these little holes, these little punctures, almost like somebody had fired a BB gun repeatedly into the seat. But Frisson knew what this actually meant. He was looking at the blast from a shotgun. And this struck Frisson as being very strange. A shotgun was just an odd weapon to use if this really was a hit, because it was big and bulky. I mean, you really couldn't carry it around in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so if you were a skilled hitman, a shotgun is not your first choice for a weapon. And so this fact, combined with the broad daylight approach, told Frisson that whoever had shot Helene and her driver was likely not an experienced hitman, but an amateur, which was not what he would have expected. Just then, Frisson heard police sirens cut through the air. His backup had arrived. Minutes later, the scene was surrounded by dozens of uniformed officers, crime scene tape, and technicians who were gathering swabs and other evidence from inside the van. The witness reports were hugely helpful, but Frisson also wanted to check if there was surveillance in the area. So, when he was done taking statements, he pulled another officer aside and asked him to go look for CCTV cameras. So, in France, many cities and towns have what's called closed-circuit television in outdoor public places, which is a network of surveillance video that law enforcement can access. Nice has more of these cameras than any city in France, so Frisson was hopeful they'd find at least one camera that caught the attack. And so the officer hurried off to go look, and Frisson decided to head back to the station while the crime scene techs finished processing the scene. After all, it was getting late, and he needed to meet with his team and make a game plan. A few hours later, Frisson was back at the station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Messineo. At this point, both of their victims, Mohammed and Helene, were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. The actual Prince of Monaco had already issued a statement of support for the Pasteurs. But Frisson wasn't worried. Of course there'd be pressure, but he knew he would have some answers soon, because police had already found 2 CCTV cameras at the scene that likely recorded the whole shooting. And so Frisson was waiting on that footage, but in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helene's immediate family and friends to see if maybe she had any enemies. Helene's children, Sylvia and Gildo, would likely know if there was anybody who wanted their mother dead. But Frisson also knew that Sylvia and Gildo were not just sources of information. They were also suspects. Now, Frisson did not have access to the details of Helene's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helene left behind was likely in the billions, which meant her death would likely make Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frisson didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger. To start with, the shooters were apparently male, and Sylvia was a woman. And secondly, Gildo was in the hospital, like he was very unwell after his stroke. However, what Frisson did think was that both of these siblings had the motive and certainly the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting on their behalf. However, Frisson had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and all of the people he wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. Since Frisson and his team were French and his crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction there. They could not just walk up to citizens of Monaco, especially very notable citizens like the Pasteurs, and demand an interview. So, in order to talk to Helene's children and her inner circle, they really couldn't even imply that they were suspects. They had to treat them really nicely and just hope they cooperate. The next morning, Frisson sat inside of a very expensive-looking living room in one of the Pasteurs' many Monaco apartment buildings. He had been up all night and was basically running on pure adrenaline. But he hoped it was worth it, because across from him on the other couch was Helene's daughter, Sylvia, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech. A large white dog paced around them. It was Helene's dog, who had been in the car during the shooting. When Frisson had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech for this interview, they were both eager to give it. And now, sitting here face to face with them, it seemed fairly obvious that they were completely devastated by what happened. Sylvia appeared to be somewhere between shock and panic, but appeared to be doing everything she could to try to stay calm. She kept taking deep breaths and looking out the living room window at the view of the Monaco harbor. As for Wojciech, he kept a hand on hers at all times, although Frisson couldn't tell if the gesture was protective or possessive. Frisson wanted to tread carefully here, because Sylvia and Wojciech could actually just kick him out at any moment, and he couldn't do anything about it. And the last thing he needed was a headline that said the French police were bullying the pastors. So he started with just some light background questions about Helene. And in a shaking voice, Sylvia described her mother as tough, but incredibly generous. She admitted that she and her mom actually did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually very close. She said Helene called her frequently because Sylvia had been battling breast cancer, and her mother liked to check in and make sure she was okay with her treatment. When Frisson asked her about enemies, Sylvia shook her head. She said that her mother tended to keep to herself and didn't typically engage with the Monaco social scene, and so the idea that somebody would want to hurt her just didn't make sense. Wojciech seemed equally mystified. He told Frisson that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together. And so he knew Helene very well, and she was a very involved grandmother, and so he said that he and Helene had always had a great relationship, and he said that she had always been very generous with his family financially, even though he had his own businesses and income, separate from the pastors. The mention of finances made Frisson perk up. He stopped Wojciech and asked him to be a bit more specific about Helene's financial generosity, and that's when he noticed a look of uncertainty cross Wojciech's face. For a second, Frisson wondered if he had touched on a sore spot. But Wojciech recovered quickly, and with an easy smile, he explained that Helene gave both Gildo and also Sylvia a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which is about 600,000 US dollars. When Frisson heard this, he had to force himself not to raise his eyebrows. That was a staggering amount of money to get every month. It was so high, in fact, that it actually made Frisson doubt whether either of Helene's kids would feel a need to kill her. But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his seat before saying that he and Sylvia used the money Helene gave them on household expenses. But if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo had spent his money on other stuff. Wojciech said that Sylvia's brother owned some companies that were not doing well, so he was presumably very deep in debt. And this, for Frisson, opened a new investigatory door. He jotted down this information on his notepad. He was meeting with Gildo next, and if Wojciech was right, the debt was a huge red flag, and made Gildo look like a pretty good suspect. The detective spoke to the couple for a bit longer, but they didn't have much else to say. So eventually, Frisson thanked them for their time, and he got up to go. When Frisson walked into Gildo's hospital room 45 minutes later, he was shocked by what he saw. He had known that Gildo was sick, but he hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. In fact, the only way he could reasonably communicate was by blinking. And so Frisson sat down at his bedside and started with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he also couldn't communicate anything more than maybe a few words at a time. And so it was obvious very quickly that due to this communication snafu, Frisson wasn't going to get much, and Gildo was very frustrated. Frisson left the hospital not long after he'd arrived. And while Gildo's actual answers had not been very helpful, Frisson did still leave that meeting with some useful information. And that was, not only was it fairly obvious that Gildo simply could not have been the one pulling the trigger just physically, but also it was clear he wasn't in any shape to be planning a hired hit. I mean, he could barely communicate with Frisson. However, Frisson thought that, it was still possible that maybe Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frisson realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have been a product of Gildo's illness. He hadn't had the chance to fully make sure everything was perfect and ready to go. So far, to Frisson, this case was full of contradictions. One of the single richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the victims' children clearly stood to inherit an enormous amount of money and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But one of the children, Sylvia, did not seem to need the money based on how much she was getting every month from Helene. And the other child, Gildo, was so physically ill that he couldn't even speak. And so Frisson began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Maybe he could have planned the hit, because he, and not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money. Frisson pulled out his phone and called the other detective, the very skilled detective named Catherine Messinio, and he told her about all the issues surrounding Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Messinio agreed with Frisson, and then she also shared something with him that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech for so long without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her own bloodline, not an outsider. Frisson considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia did not completely trust Wojciech. But it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then Messinio said something else that made Frisson stop thinking about the Pastors completely. Messinio said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle and had been for years. He was from Egypt and had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Messinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France so they could speak to him about it. As Frisson hung up the phone, his mind reeled. This whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was, Helene. But now, he was wondering if maybe he'd been wrong. That afternoon, Frisson was back at the station with Messinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and still neither of the detectives had slept. But Frisson didn't think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the CCTV footage had just arrived. And Frisson was putting a lot of hope into this footage because it felt like every lead he'd tried to follow in this case so far had hit some kind of a dead end. Frisson had just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He didn't think his father's love triangle lead meant much. He said the mistress had actually been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and believe it or not, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters, but Frisson hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam would want to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. And so, Frisson and Messinio began scrolling through the CCTV footage, looking for any clue that could point them in some new direction. And when they got to the point in the recording where the actual shooting happened, they were relieved to see that they had a clear view. They watched the shooting play out on the screen, just like all the witnesses had described. Helene's car turned out of the hospital parking lot, then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frisson also could see there was a second man who watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, who most likely was acting as a lookout. Both of these men ran away on foot, and their faces were not visible in the footage. And so Frisson rewound the tape to see when the men arrived, which he found was about 20 minutes before the shooting. But when he saw how these men arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found a really good lead that he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the scene in taxis. Frisson paused the tape and turned to Messinio in total shock. In 30 years of working in law enforcement, he had never seen or heard of a criminal arriving at a crime scene just very casually in a taxi, like they were meeting somebody for lunch. And there was a reason for this, because on the CCTV footage, there was a huge piece of evidence that was now clearly visible to the detectives, one of the taxi's license plates. And so Frisson smiled and told Messinio they needed to make a phone call. That evening, Frisson, Messinio, and a group of officers rushed into the lobby of the Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frisson's hands was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved really fast. The taxi dispatch had a record of the rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers used to book each cab. It hadn't taken long for Frisson's team to connect those numbers to two burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. The police were able to access the CCTVs near that store and literally watch the shooters leave with their phones and catch a train to Nice. And best of all, one of the cameras at the train station gave the police a very clear shot of the shooters' faces. Neither of them were Helene's or Mohammed's relatives, which didn't surprise Frisson since he was sure this had to be a hired hit, even if it was sloppy. But in order to find out who masterminded this attack, he needed to ID these two shooters, which was why he was now at this hotel. CCTV footage had shown that once the shooters got to Nice, they stopped at the Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So Frisson approached the reception desk with the picture and asked the person manning it if they had seen the men in the photo. The person seemed confused, but he said yes, those men had rented 2 separate rooms the day before, but they had already left. Frisson wrote down the names the receptionist gave him, but neither were familiar. Then he and Messinio split up to go search the rooms. Moments later, Frisson and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room. The teller at the front desk had told him that this would be the case. The maids had already been in and out of these rooms. But actually seeing it cleaned up was still very disappointing for Frisson. If there had been any evidence here, it likely had been thrown out with the cleaning service. But just then, he heard an officer call out from the bathroom. Frisson went in there, and he found one of his officers pointing to the shower, where a used bottle of shower gel was sitting on the side of the tub. Frisson couldn't believe it. He knew no other guests had been in these rooms since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was one of theirs. The maid must have just missed it during the cleaning. Frisson told the officer to bag it. It was a long shot, but he wanted to get it sent to a lab and tested right away for DNA. Maybe it could lead them to one of their shooters. They left the hotel soon after, at which point Frisson decided it was time to finally get some sleep. On May 16, 2014, investigators Frisson and Messinio paced around Frisson's office. Every now and then, they would glance over at a document that was laying on his desk. It had only been 10 days since Helene and her driver Mohammed were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helene was still alive and in a coma, but Mohammed had died, which made Frisson the official lead of a murder investigation. Which was daunting, but Frisson felt like they were close to breaking this case, because the document sitting on his desk right now told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooter's hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it, and it had matched to somebody in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed. And then, through a series of phone taps, they'd managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. The names were different from the ones the hotel had given Frisson, so the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked in. Both of them had prior criminal records, and like Frisson had suspected, they were not professional killers, just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the country. So it made sense that these two men from that area might have agreed to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frisson or Messinio was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anyone in Helene's life. The pastors in their inner circle were literally some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frisson would have expected them to hire more experienced and professional assassins because they just had the means to do it. And so now, Frisson wondered if maybe they needed to look deeper into other areas of Helene's life, like her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking to Helene's friends that she had handled many of her tenants personally, and it was possible there was a feud or dispute that they didn't know about. But thousands of people lived in Helene's buildings. Going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frisson and Messinio had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frisson called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayir, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. And while they were figuring all this out, Frisson's phone rang. And when he picked it up, the news on the other end changed their case yet again. It was the hospital. Helene had woken up from her coma. First thing the next morning, Frisson sent Messinio to the hospital to interview Helene, then waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping Helene could simply tell Messinio who it was that shot her, and then they could close out the case. But when Messinio came back that afternoon, she didn't have good news. Apparently, Helene had told Messinio that she was terrified and had lots of things she wanted to say to the police, and she seemed to be on the verge of actually giving Messinio a name but then she started struggling to breathe and literally couldn't finish her sentence. Messineo said that at that moment, the medical staff rushed in and they were able to stabilize Helene, but they weren't able to continue the interview. Frisson was so disappointed. They'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the victim, and now they might never know. And he was right, because 4 days later, on May 21st, still without having finished that interview, Helene Pastor died. Two weeks later, in early June, Frisson parked his car and walked inside the station to start his day. He was incredibly anxious because Helene and Mohammed's case had stagnated, and Helene's death only made the pressure on him and his team even more intense. The public in both France and Monaco were demanding answers, and so too were Helene's family and also members of the royal family. Frisson still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also working down that huge list of Helene's tenants, but hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Now, that didn't mean they wouldn't, but right now, none of the people they were seeing fit as suspects. Now, Frisson had not totally eliminated his very first suspects, Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but Frisson just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Now, Gildo potentially needed some big windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frisson had not actually confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's very poor health made it basically impossible for him to have been one of the shooters, and also made it extremely unlikely he could have orchestrated the hit. There was Sylvia, who also got a big inheritance from Helene's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive, and it just didn't seem like she was desperate for cash. As for Wojciech, he wasn't married to Sylvia, so he had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helene's death didn't do him any good. Plus, he also benefited from the massive allowance that Sylvia got because they were a couple. Now, all of this would be cleared up if Frisson could look at the Pastor's finances and see who actually needed a payday. But Helene's inner circle lived by different rules than the average person. They were some of the richest people in the world, and their status and money insulated them from almost everything, even the law. Basically, because of their status, they didn't have to share their personal information with the police. And all of this was swirling around Frisson's head as he stepped inside the station. But as soon as he did, he saw Messineo hurrying towards him with a piece of paper in her hand. It was covered in lines of numbers that Frisson right away recognized as a call log. And Messineo explained that they had traced one of Alhair's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived there. And a few of those clients were also people that Frisson and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frisson grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he looked back up at Messineo. They needed Pascal's phone records right now, because if they could see who Pascal regularly called and when, they might be able to figure out who ordered the hit. Later that day, Frisson sat at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records and discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this case, like the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helene's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frisson knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right this whole time. Because in Monaco, everything really was about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helene Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6, 2014. On that day, around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode towards Helene's black van. He could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she screamed at her driver to drive. But before the driver could hit the gas, Samin raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. He watched as Helene and Mohammed convulsed from the force of the blasts. He didn't know the people he had just shot, but he wasn't thinking about that. Samin was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for having shot these people. Once Helene and Mohammed slumped over in their seats, Samin turned and sprinted in the other direction as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Al-Hayir, would follow shortly after, just like they planned. As Samin ran, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area. He ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before getting to his hotel. Once inside, he sat down on his bed to call the man who had hired him. Somewhere across the city, Pascal Doriac heard his phone ring, and he told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then hurried out of the personal gym he had been in and stepped into a marble hallway before picking up the call. Then, he listened as Samin told him the good news. The job was done. Pascal smiled and ended the call, and noticed that for the first time in months, his hands had stopped shaking. Even though he originally had been hired to actually carry out the hit on Helene, he wasn't a killer. He didn't have the kind of money his clients did, but he'd been part of their world for a long time. So he knew if you don't want to do something yourself, you get somebody else to do it. And now it was all over, and it sounded like everything had gone according to plan. So Pascal looked down at his phone and texted the real killer. That is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place. Seconds later, the real killer heard their phone buzz as a text came in. The sound made their heart pound. They knew it was their trainer, Pascal, and so they were incredibly nervous as they picked up the phone to read the message. But when the real killer read what it said, they just smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over them that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan had worked. Then they sank back into their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out, Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. Because it was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be the successful businessman, but really, all the companies he was involved in were failing and in deep financial trouble. And this had been going on for years. Wojciech had been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance just to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if Sylvia died, he'd lose everything. He believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could steal it from her and wipe out his debts before she died. Wojciech had also lied to investigators about his relationship with Helene. In truth, they hated each other, and Helene was very suspicious that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. That's why she had told the police she was afraid when she woke up from her coma. She was afraid of Wojciech. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriac, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. Gildo eventually recovered from his stroke and moved to the United States, while Sylvia would give Mohammed's son a job and would let his family live in one of her properties. On August 23, 2013, inside of a little home in a Russian suburb, 8-year-old Maria Chelyasheva was hard at work at her kitchen table drawing a picture of a horse. Maria's parents had recently brought her to a farm where she was able to do some pony riding, and ever since then, she had become obsessed with horses and ponies. And so as Maria was hard at work on her drawing, her father, 42-year-old Mikhail, was right nearby at the kitchen stove dicing up onions, and as he did, his eyes were kind of watering from cutting the onions, and so he was making a show of turning around and looking at his daughter, pretending to cry, and Maria thought it was very funny. And then at some point, as Mikhail was doing this, he realized he was missing a key ingredient for the dinner he was preparing. So he kind of threw up his hands in exasperation, and then he yelled out into the house to his wife, hey, do we have any potatoes? And from somewhere in the back of the house, Maria's mother called back, yes, we do, they're down in the cellar, but they're pretty old. And so Mikhail finished chopping his onions, he threw them into a hot pan, and then he walked out of the kitchen, poking Maria playfully as he walked by, and she kind of laughed at him. And then Maria watched as her father walked through the living room, past Maria's grandmother and brother, and he walked over to this door that was right at the beginning of this hallway, and that door led down into the cellar. And so Maria, she stopped for a moment and just watched as her dad opened the cellar door, began walking down the steps, and he shut the door behind him. And then Maria just went back to coloring in her horse. But after a few minutes, Maria started to smell something really bad, and she looked up, and she saw the onions that were on the burner were starting to burn, and smoke was going up into the ceiling, and then suddenly the smoke alarm went off, and as this commotion is happening, Maria's grandmother runs into the kitchen and begins fanning the smoke. She turns off the burner and moves the onions, and then Maria's mother comes running into the kitchen, and she's seeing what's happening, and she's looking around. She doesn't see her husband, and so very frustratedly, she yells out, "Mikhail, you burned the onions. Come in and deal with this." But Mikhail was not on the first floor. He was still down in the cellar. And so Maria's mother knew that, and she was kind of annoyed that he was taking so long down there. And so after muttering something under her breath, she stormed out of the kitchen, walked over to the cellar door, opened it up, went downstairs, shutting the door behind her. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Maria's grandmother was now going through the burned onions, looking for any that were salvageable, and Maria had gone back to her horse drawing. But after about 5 minutes, it dawned on Maria that her parents had still not come out of the cellar yet, and it just felt like too much time had passed. They should be up by now. And so Maria stopped working on her picture and just stared down the hall at the cellar door. And at the same time, Maria's grandmother had stopped with the onions, and she too had come over and was watching from right next to Maria down the hall at the cellar door. Both of them just expecting the parents to emerge any second. But as the seconds ticked by, nobody emerged from the cellar, and so finally, Maria's grandmother said, "Okay, I'm gonna go see what's going on." And so Maria watched as her grandmother walked through the living room, past Maria's brother, who was playing a video game, and then Maria's grandmother, right in front of the closed cellar door, just yelled out, "Hey, are you guys okay down there?" But there was no response from the cellar. And so with this, Maria's grandmother turned around and told Maria's brother to turn off his video game because it was so noisy. Maybe they were calling from the cellar and they couldn't hear them. And so the brother, who was just totally frustrated by this whole situation, he paused his game. And then Maria's grandmother called out again, "Hey, are you guys okay down there?" And this time, when there was still silence, Maria's brother, he just stood up and said, "Okay, why don't we just go downstairs and make sure they're okay? Why aren't we doing that?" And so without waiting for a response from his grandmother, Maria's brother just walked right over to the cellar door. He opened it up and he looked down and he goes, "Look, they're right there." And then the brother began walking down the steps, yelling to his parents, "Hey, come on, when's dinner? What's going on?" And as he did, he shut the door behind him. And so after this, Maria's grandmother walked back into the kitchen and sat with Maria as the two of them stared at the cellar door, expecting their family to return any second now, but they didn't. And so at this point, both Maria and her grandmother were really starting to panic. They could tell something was wrong. And so Maria's grandmother grabbed her phone and called a neighbor and just said, "Hey, can you come over? I think something's wrong. I don't know what it is." And then after Maria's grandmother hung up the phone, instead of waiting for the neighbor to come over, Maria's grandmother just got up and walked right over to the cellar door, then opened the door and began walking down the stairs. But this time, the grandmother left the door open. And so Maria was able to listen from her seat in the kitchen to the sound of her grandmother's footsteps making their way down the stairs. And then at some point, Maria heard what sounded like a distinct thud and then silence. Now, at this point, Maria is terrified. The neighbor has not come over yet. And so without knowing what else to do, she just got up and walked over to the open cellar door and just stared down into the darkness down below. She couldn't see anything, but she was too scared to even call out to her family. And then finally, she just began descending the stairs herself. 10 minutes later, the neighbor who Maria's grandmother had called finally arrived over at their house. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer, and so he tried the doorknob, found it unlocked, so he opened it up and he stepped inside. And right away, he looked around and it was totally quiet. There was nobody on the first floor of the house. But the neighbor immediately heard crying, and he walked around the first floor listening for where it was coming from, and he realized when he got to the top of the open door leading down into the cellar that the crying was coming from down there. And so without a thought, the neighbor just ran down the stairs, and he couldn't believe what he found. He found Maria, the 8-year-old, just crying on the ground, and all around her was her entire family just laying on the ground. Now, the neighbor had no idea what was going on, but sensing clearly there was some sort of emergency based on the call he got and what he was seeing now, he just scooped up Maria, ran upstairs, and ran out of the house and began screaming for help. When help arrived, they would search the house and make their way down into the cellar, and they would discover that Maria's entire family, her grandmother, her brother, her parents, they were all dead. and what had killed them were the very potatoes that Mikhail had gone down to get. It would turn out Maria's mother was right when she warned Mikhail that the potatoes they had downstairs were very old. In fact, they were so old, they had begun to rot, and as they rotted, they produced this toxic fume that did not ventilate out of the cellar. The cellar was totally enclosed, there was no windows, and the family had this habit of always shutting the door whenever they went down into the cellar. And so over time, this fume had totally filled the entire cellar, and one by one, as family members went down into the cellar, sealing the door behind them, they passed out from these fumes and then died. Maria was the only one who survived going down into the cellar because her grandmother, who had gone down right before her, had left the door open. And so by the time Maria had gone down, a lot of the toxic fumes had found their way up the stairs and escaped into the rest of the house. And so when Maria went down there, it was not nearly as toxic. Our next story is called Table for Two. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France looking for work, somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would cook up some beef and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house and they went out to the back patio where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth, and on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread, and Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor, we're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name, and Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around, and she was used to them spending lots of time together, and she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys are up late, having wine, celebrating, whatever. She was just going to shut the window and try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out that window again and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then, at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business, and so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house, and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later, around noon, she looked again into Lucien's backyard and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucien is sitting at the table and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucien, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucien's backyard, and as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized that they were not moving at all. Like they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on, and they got these big pots of water, and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucien with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucien and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide. And the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so for a minute, investigators kind of scrambled because they're like, okay, if it wasn't poison in their food, what else could have killed these guys? There was nothing at the scene that would give away what could have killed them. And so they were just stumped. And so police were kind of confused for a minute. But then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucien, and everything changed. Lucien and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. They died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucien and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucien had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth. And Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucien and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucien's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucien cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucien was missing teeth and he loved this beef rib so much, he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite and he began to choke. And when that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend who's basically dying right in front of him. And the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart, which is already enlarged and fragile, and he had a heart attack and died. And then Lucian, who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated and died as well, hunched over at the table. The next and final story of today's episode is called Lucky Day. On an April morning in 1993, a surfer named John Doyle was sitting on a surfboard out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, just scanning the water waiting for a wave. John was totally alone out here. There were no other surfers, nothing, and the only sign of human civilization anywhere was John's Land Rover, which was parked up on the sand on the beach. John was an American. He was from Colorado, and so his experience had always been, lots of snow and mountains and trees, because that's Colorado. But now here, off the coast of Africa, it was like a totally different planet. And in fact, today, John was really feeling that because the sun was so hot that day. It was over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and he could actually feel his back starting to burn as he sat there, waiting for the next wave. And so he told himself, actually, that he would just catch one more wave and then call it a day to avoid a sunburn. But as John continued to kind of scan out across the water waiting for this wave, he noticed about 20 meters away was a shark fin swimming in a circle, like stereotypical terrifying shark behavior. And so John is horrified and he wants to get out of the water immediately, but he's far enough away from shore that if he jumped into the water to swim to shore, he's going to be in the water with the shark thrashing around. He's just going to attract the shark over to him. And so John decides his only hope here to escape the shark is actually just to surf it. That way he'll stay out of the water. It's much faster. He'll get to shore. The shark can't follow him there. It'll be fine. And so, trying to stay calm, John continued to keep his eye on the shark that was still 20 meters away, and he also really looked closely for any swell coming towards him that might be big enough to allow him to surf to shore. And thankfully, after only a couple of minutes, John did see a swell coming towards him that seemed like it would be perfect for a final wave. And so at this point, John is facing out to sea, towards the swell, towards the shark that's still 20 meters away, and he turns himself around, so he's facing towards shore, and then he lays down on his stomach, and he begins to paddle towards shore. And as he's doing this, he's checking the swell to see when it's going to come up, when he can stand up, and eventually the swell is right underneath him, and as he's about to stand up on his board and actually surf into shore, he looks into the water that has not quite formed into a wave yet, and he sees the shark. It's literally underneath him. And so John has this sudden surge of adrenaline, and he just jumps up onto his board. He stands up, and for a second, he's stable. He's surfing, and he's riding this wave away from the shark. He's doing exactly what he hoped he could do. He can't believe it. And then, because he was panicked, because he was rushing, because it was a new board, who knows why, the nose of his board suddenly dipped just long enough to throw John off his board and into the water with the shark. And so immediately, as this wave is churning John over, he grabs onto his surfboard and just kind of holds on, and he's waiting for a moment when the wave stops so he can get out of the water, back on his board, and away from the shark. But before the wave even stopped tumbling him over, John suddenly felt this searing pain in his calf. And so John, who's underwater, still clutching his board, he opens his eyes underwater, then he looks down, and through the cloudy water, he can see very clearly it is the shark, and it's a great white shark that is latched on to his leg. And so now, in a total panic, John began punching the nose of the shark, and when he did, the shark actually recoiled and released his leg long enough that John could pull it out. He actually managed to get up onto his board again, and just a second later, almost out of instinct, he was back standing on his board, just surfing along with a leg that was now bleeding profusely into the water. And for a second, John was stable and appeared to be kind of moving towards shore again, but then the shark, it doubled around and swam at John from the side and literally smashed into him, knocking him off the board back into the water. But this time, John managed, when he fell this second time, to actually grab on to the board with both hands. So he has two hands on the board, he's getting tumbled in the water again, but he knows the shark is going to come for him. And so at the last second, he pulled the board close to his body and kind of turned himself like it was a shield. And the shark came flying towards him and bit him, but because he used that surfboard as a shield, the shark just bit the surfboard, ripped off half of it and swam off with it and began mauling this half of the surfboard. And John, with the other half of the surfboard, he somehow managed to stand up on it. Again, his leg is bleeding everywhere, and he rode this damaged half surfboard into shore successfully away from the shark. And so when John pulled himself up onto the sand, out of the water, he looked back and he saw the shark swimming off. And even though he's in excruciating pain from this attack, he was so relieved. He couldn't believe he actually just survived that. But John did not have time to think about, what good fortune this was in a way, because he was an hour away from the nearest civilization. And between where he was now and that town, there was nothing. There weren't homes, there weren't buildings, there weren't offices, nothing. It was just totally wildlands until you got to that town. And so John knew he would need to get in his car and drive all the way to that town and then get the people of the town to go get medical help. So, he is hours away from getting the help he needs. And so he has no time to waste. And so he crawls through the sand. His leg is killing him, but he's just so focused on getting up to his Land Rover. And he manages to get to his car. He opens the door. He climbs in the driver's seat. And then as soon as he's in there, he shuts and locks the doors. And then he grabs a white t-shirt that he had on the passenger seat and he ripped it into strips. And he used those strips like tourniquets and he wrapped them around his leg, the leg that was bleeding from his calf. And he basically used this tourniquet to attempt to cut off blood flow to his entire right leg to stop the bleeding, to save his life. But the wound on his right leg was so bad and so deep that despite putting on multiple very tight tourniquets, it just wasn't doing very much. He was still losing blood at a pace that likely would kill him before he got to town. And so John was kind of like, well, nothing else I can do but attempt to go to town. So he fired up his car, he reversed off the beach, and began making his way towards town. As John sped along the road, he began to feel very lightheaded. Between the pain in his leg and the extreme heat outside, he just felt very dehydrated and weak. And so he thought to himself, if I can't get a sip of water soon, I'm going to pass out right now and then I'm done for. And so as he's driving along, John began fumbling around his car, looking for any sort of liquid somewhere in the car. But ultimately, all he found was an empty water bottle. And all he saw in every direction was just this barren African savanna with no people and no water anywhere. And so John just kept on driving, hoping eventually he might find some water source. And luckily, after only a couple of minutes, when his eyelids were really starting to droop and he was having a hard time focusing, he noticed up ahead there was a copse of trees with a little creek that ran through it. And so immediately John pulled over and he got out and he hobbled his way over to the water. He laid down on his stomach so his face is basically right over the water. And then he just put his face in the water and began to drink. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to slow down. He felt himself relax a little bit. And he started to think to himself like, hey, I found water, I'm doing okay. Maybe I will survive this. But right as John was starting to feel optimistic, he felt a new shooting pain on his right side. And so with a little bit of strength he had, he managed to turn his head and looked to see what was going on. And staring back at him was a lion who had just bit his side and was now growling and staring at John and beginning to move its jaw left and right to really sink its teeth into John. Now, this is unbelievably painful for John, and he's already dealing with an unbelievable pain in his leg from the shark attack. And so John's experiencing pain that very few people ever get to experience. And it caused this unbelievable surge of adrenaline. One that you would likely get basically right before you die. That was the level of adrenaline he was getting. And with this adrenaline rush, he grabbed a stick and he began hitting this lion who's locked onto his ribs. And he managed to beat the lion off of him. And the lion, it only backed up maybe a few feet, and it's still totally fixated on John, and it's growling and edging towards him. But John, all he could do was just attempt to get to his Land Rover. And so as soon as the lion had let go of him, he just stood up and kind of pathetically began hobbling as fast as he could towards his Land Rover. And he literally just walked past this lion who's still growling at him, kind of trying to size him up. And he just kept on walking towards his car, and he was almost there when he noticed the sound of the lion growling behind him, which had been constant to this point, had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. And when he turned around, he saw now there was not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There was at least 4 lions that now had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John and moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. And so John just turned back around so his back is to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continues hobbling towards his car. And as he walked, the lions began swiping at him and cutting his legs open and his arms open. I mean, they're like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him, but they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. And then right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, was when John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. And when he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process. And so John basically just resigned himself to die in his car right here. Like he knew, I'm going to die in the next few hours. There's nothing I can do. And so he just kind of sat there and waited. And 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle. And then he heard it a few more times, and before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. And then he hears what sounds like a series of shutter flashes, like camera flashes. And, he's looking around. He can't quite figure out what's even going on because, again, he has all these injuries. He's lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passes out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari that was happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover surrounded by lions. And so as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. And so those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. And then after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover, because now the lions are gone, and they would take him to a hospital where doctors and nurses would have to give him 250 stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen's podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen.
Our head of production is Zach Levitt, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one